It was a dark night on the high mountain tops in the north. James and Connor were both freezing cold, but were warm inside with excitement. There was still about 2 hours until they climbed the ominous mountains, but already the sun was dawning on the other side of the mountain ranges. Connor, the one who was considered the most courageous of the two, was packing for the hike, whilst James, the careful and meticulous one, was already packed and sitting by the fire, thinking about their adventure ahead. He had done all the planning for the trip, while Connor had just tagged along, and until then, they had not faced any real problems. As they boarded on the last plane to the mountains, James had seen a weather report stating that there will be strong winds blowing in the mountains, and it is advised that no climbers should attempt to weather it.
Come on, James.
Exclaimed Connor, stepping up to the ladder.
Let's go!
James, not wanting to lose Connor on the plane, dismissed the thought about the weather, one thing he does not do very often, and hoped that the information was false. It had taken about 3 hours to get to base camp, and the flight had been quite boring. There were no TVs in the back of the seats, no flight attendants, and most of the few people on the flight were asleep. James, however, was unable to catch a wink of sleep, and was perched on the end of his seat, pondering about the hike. When the plane had landed, he dragged all their luggage out of the plane and heaped them on the glistening white snow, the sun's rays touching everything in its sight. See, he thought to himself, what was I worrying about? When Connor stepped out of the plane, the sleep still in his eyes, he yawned and stretched his arms high above his head.
You have good sleep?
He asked while struggling down the stairs onto the snow. Yes, James, he said, obviously lying. He didn't want to tell Connor that he had stayed up all night worrying about their hike. Connor would tell him there was nothing to be worried about and he was just being a scaredy cat. At base camp, it was much like the plane trip there. Not much happened, except planning and more planning after that. Connor went out to explore the small expanse of the base camp and a little beyond that. He came back puffing and panting, saying,
Snow is so heavy out here. It makes it really difficult to walk through. It's as thick as honey.
After that, Connor went and changed because his long pants are all wet due to the snow. However, he came out in bright green shorts. Are you crazy? Challenged James.
What? They're just shorts.
This is something they usually bickered about. James added that it was below 0 degrees outside, and it was only warm inside because of the huge fire. Connor said that he had just used his last pair of long pants to go outside with. They argued for a few more minutes, then James just gave up. There was no change in Connor's mind when he had the idea in his head. That brought them to tonight. They were all packed and getting ready to climb the mountain. They were getting instructions on what to do if they got lost or separated from each other. But the wind was howling and it was hard to hear anything in this weather. James was going to ask the instructors to repeat what he had just said, but Connor was already pulling his arm and weeping.
Come on, James. Let's climb.
As James was being tugged away, one of the instructors bellowed, "Wait, Connor! You need to have proper climbing gear, not shorts! It's too dangerous out there!" But the boys were already out of sight. "Damn snow!" the instructor groaned. The boys had been climbing for about 20 minutes, the rope keeping them tied together, hanging limp in front of James. The wind was roaring around them, as loud as a lion. James couldn't even see more than a few meters in front of him. Just at that moment, the rope snapped. His mind flashed back to the flight here, when he saw the news report stating the extreme weather up near the mountains. He went to call out to Connor. "Connor!" But felt no weight at the end of the rope. He got a sudden stab of icy cold fear shoot down his spine, even colder than the temperatures he was enduring. He called out Connor's name again and again, but even if he was there, the wind would have snatched up his words and thrown them miles and miles away. He fell to his knees and hoped for Connor's life. But then there was a sudden rumble that echoed louder than the howling wind and snow. James's mind searched for an answer. Monsters? The abominable snowman? Then the more sensible side took over. No, it can't be. Those things aren't real. Just as James was attempting to figure out what it was, snow started rumbling down the mountain at a rapid pace. As James looked up, more and more fell, and then more, and even more. He suddenly realized what was going on. He picked himself off his knees and shouted, "Run!" to anyone who could hear him, but he was alone in this nightmare. James ran as fast as his legs could carry him, but still the rumbling was getting louder and louder. Then, all at once, the snow picked him up and hurled him into the air. James was blinded by all the snow and had no idea where or when he was going to land. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like days, but eventually, the snow slowed down to a stop. He dug himself out of the top level of snow, soaking wet and undoubtedly cold. He made out a dark cave in the distance and dragged himself towards the mouth of it, and lay on the hard stone floor, taking deep breaths. He thought about how lucky he was to have survived the avalanche and made it into a good shelter like this. He dragged himself deeper into the cave, away from the glistening white snow and towards the never-ending darkness. He eventually recovered from the bumps and bruises he gained from tumbling down the mountain, but he still had no idea where he was. His mind turned back to Connor. He might have survived. If anyone could survive that, it'd be him. Then he would head towards the next base we were aiming for. With his mind made, James stumbled towards the end of the cave to see where it ended. James had been walking for what seemed like hours, until he came out onto a ledge. It turned out the cave was actually a tunnel leading out here. He looked across the gaping hole that swallowed up all the light around it. There was a little wooden bridge that reached across the hole, but it was rotting and had wet moss hanging off the sides. James looked for any other way across the hole, but it was just an empty space in snow. He looked at the bridge in front of him, the small, weak bridge, and a spark flared within him. He looked around at the gloomy cave he had come from and never looked back. He ran towards the bridge, adrenaline pumping through every bone in his body, and leaped onto it. He then ran full speed across the bridge, wooden planks snapping underneath his flying feet. He was just about halfway across when the bridge sagged down towards the gaping hole, ready to swallow him whole. The spark flared even brighter, and his heartbeat pumped in his ears. Boom, boom. The wood broke underneath him and he fell through, and grabbed the plank in front of him and swung himself towards the flat ground residing in front of him as a kid would on monkey bars on a playground. But this was no playground. There was about 100 meters between him and the ground below him, but this did not stop James. He kept swinging like a monkey towards his goal. 10 meters, then 5, then none. He had made it. He pulled himself up onto the ledge and turned around to look at the bridge. It had lost a lot of planks and looked worse for wear than it did before, but he had made it. He lay on the ground a bit, panting once again at what he had just survived. However, it took him less time to recover, and after about 2 minutes, he got up and headed into the direction of where he thought the base camp was. He walked for miles, the sparks still flaring in him, giving him the energy to keep going. He encountered wolves and many other problems, but managed to fight them off just using his fists and wits. When he came into sight of the base camp, he bounded down the hill and into the camp. People ran towards him and buzzed around, asking questions on what had happened. He was in the middle of telling them what had happened when he saw Connor stumble out of the nearest tent.
Connor, over here!
Connor slowly wobbled over and the crowd parted to let him through. Now James realized why Connor was limping. His leg was in a cast and he was walking with crutches towards the hole in the crowd.
Hey,
He said with a sly smile on his face.
what took you so long?